Disclaimer: the intro to this video contains sarcasm and therefore may not be appropriate for all audiences. Have you ever wondered how the 1% or 0.1% stay the 0.1%? What closely guarded secrets do they hold? And have you ever wanted to get your hands on them? Well, to start with, you can't, because the biggest secret to becoming part of the 1% or 0.1% in Path of Exile is to play for about 27 hours a day, which requires time machines. And because time machines are a Class Q restricted technology, and any knowledge of them as a result, well, if I disclosed it, I'd have to kill you and then destroy the entire timeline, so we don't want that happening. Meaning you'll never get to be part of a 1% or 0.1%. Sorry if this broke any dreams or shattered any hopes. Sometimes the time police just are that strict. Don't worry though, there are things you can do to improve your builds in ways that might not be apparently obvious. And so today, I'm going to go through 3 ways in which I improved my current build, CI cast on crit forbidden right, and some ways that you might be able to leverage that in your own builds. Not all of these methods will be right for everyone. In fact, quite a few of them require a fair bit of patience, which, if you're lacking that, you're probably going to struggle with the economics of Path of Exile. Very often, jumping on hot new trends in Path of Exile is one of the best ways to go broke, or at the very least, is the second best way to go broke, behind re-rolling. So to start with, crafting your own gear. Crafting your own gear generally means look at pieces that have a low cost to entry and a high return if done over a lot of different attempts. So for example, my ring. This ring is pretty unique. Last I saw, there aren't any quite like it. It's maybe not perfect. After all, the strength is a little bit lacking, but I could work with that. And it's got T1 ES, Crit Multi, which is an Essence mod, and of course, Despair. Short of combining Fractured Despair bases with Synthesis bases, this is about as good as it's going to get. I was paying around 20 Chaos a piece for bulk Synthesis bases, and about 20 Chaos a piece for the Despair rings. I was then using Deafening Essence of Scorn to add Global Crit Multi. And usually I'd take a couple of these, so let's just say 2 essences on average, since I wanted a somewhat not terrible base. Last I checked, Scorn were about 32 in Exalt, so we can assume 12 C in essences. I'd often have to annul to try to get open affixes where I wanted for the combination, and so in total it's about 68 C per attempt, assuming 2 essences and 1 annulment orb. Obviously, each attempt would vary. I bought enough supplies for 15 attempts, and do be aware that the more things you buy, the more attempts you have, the more you're going to impact prices, and because prices shift over time, things might not cost the same today as when I did it. They could be cheaper or they could be more expensive. But I got 3 successes out of those 15 attempts, and a couple other failures that were pretty sellable. The ring that I'm currently using was by far the best, since it has the strength which is useful to my build, and of course, the tier 1 energy shield. So for around 6 exalted orbs, I got this ring crafted. I then sold one of the other quote-unquote failures. It had Chaos Res, which is not useful to me at all as a CI build, but was very useful to someone else, for 12 exalts. I've already doubled my money. And I also sold a couple of other well-rolled failures, things that hadn't ended up combining Crit Multi, Despair, and the Synth base, but did things like Crit Multi and Despair on a non-synth ring. So I ended up recouping some profit that way as well. All told, I'm at about plus 14 exalts after spending the 6 to make the items. Now, I could have gone a different route. I could have gone with a plus 1 power charge ring. And a plus 1 power charge ring would be a little bit better, by about 5%. But I probably wouldn't be recombining multiple bases and going through trying to make the best possible item from a selection of dozens. To do that would take thousands of exalted orbs and quite simply isn't practical given how small the market is. So instead, because I cared about the quality of rolls on the item and I wanted to transfer things that I couldn't naturally roll on the item itself, I went for quantity over quality. And very often you can get a higher quality item from going for that quantity even if there is a little bit of RNG. But even if I didn't get something within the 15 attempts that I made, I could always just sell things and go again. I was doing this profitably, and all that really would have meant is I made 28x instead of 14. And I did the same thing with my gloves. My gloves were about 20 to an exalt for high ES, high item level bases. I then took 10 exalts in fossils, and spent about 20x on things like non-defense to defense, meta mods for Veiled Chaos, and a couple of Eldritch Chaos and exalts and annuls to fix suffixes. On the final pair I decided to use, I also spent about 10 exalts on Ichors and Embers to get the +2, since if I was smashing a bunch together, I couldn't do that as the first part of a craft. So my total costs were about 40x. I got my gloves, and I got several pairs which sold for between 2 and 17 exalts each, depending on the ES and the suffixes. The total return was 63x, so again, I made about 20x in profit. Now I had been wanting the mythical 6x tier 1, but realistically, I needed either Dex or Int on my gloves. Technically Dex, Int, or Strength, but remember the ring already took care of Strength, and that won't roll naturally, so that's already out. Between Dex or Int, well, I happened to roll Dex first, and I could get the Int elsewhere a little bit more easily, so that was kind of ideal. I was flexible in what I wanted since I knew this was one of the pieces that would be a little bit harder to get, assuming that I was just going to go out and buy it. There aren't that many people crafting ES gloves with the Chaos and Chaos Crit suffix from the Veiled modifiers. I could have gone out and bought some. Last I checked, they were about 30x, which is technically less than I spent rolling mine. Remember, I spent 40. But there's no opportunity for profit there unless someone else is interested in buying that item later. So I actually made more money by crafting it myself, even if I technically spent more as well. But what are examples of things that someone might want to buy later that you know isn't going to be your forever item? I'm about to get into that. But before I do, a quick reminder that if you've been finding the video helpful, please leave a like, as that's a great way to help me out completely for free. If you have any questions about Cast on Crit Forbidden Right, then be sure to hop into my Discord, as there's a lot of helpful people there who have played the build before. And after you're done with this video, if you're looking for more content, then check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts, where I'm going to be talking about the summer Steam sale and some games that are well worth the money. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members for their continued support, but more about that at the end. For now, I'm going to talk about my boots. I knew that I wanted elevated tailwind, elevated cooldown recovery, and I ended up live searching and buying a pair for 15 exalts. This was well below the market rate, and I could see why. While all the other boots on the market had finished prefixes, this one didn't, and that can be a little bit intimidating. But it's not too hard to do suffixes can't be changed plus Veiled Chaos. So for the first pair, my total cost was about 17x, as I hit what I wanted on the first try. I then threw a Krakic Maw on it, and got some ES, which raised the overall value and the ES of the item. But later on, I wanted to rework my gear, and I needed more resists. So what I did is I put up a new live search, this time for Tier 1 resistances, in addition to the elevated tailwind and elevated cooldown recovery. And so I bought a new pair for 30 exalts. This meant that I had 2 pairs of boots, and while technically I could wear one on each foot, they wouldn't match, and that's not very fashionable. So I sold the old pair for 45 exalts. And finally, as I was switching around my gear yet again, especially after replacing my Onslaught ring, well, I needed new boots. Yet again. I know, I probably shouldn't be so wasteful, and I should stick to one pair of shoes instead of collecting them. But this time, I wanted Tier 1 intelligence. So I bought this pair, the most expensive yet, for 40 exalts. And then sold my old pair with Tier 1 resist for 50. Because I was patient and willing to buy one below market price, other people who were not patient ended up paying more money. In total, I spent 87 exalts on my boots. But I got back 95x from selling the 2 pairs that I wasn't using. Meaning, I didn't actually spend any money on them. I made 8 exalts in profit, on top of getting my exact ideal item. Which is also something that I did with my ring, except I only went through one iteration. I bought the original base for about 30, and the second base for, I think it was 34 or something, and I rolled the first one and sold it for 45, so there wasn't really as much profit there, but if I'd continued to iterate and gone for an even more perfect ring, maybe I would have made a profit there. Instead, I just got a little bit of a discount. And now the last thing I want to talk about here is items that hold their value. Because a lot of upgrades kind of work like cars, where the minute you drive your shiny new car off the lot, it loses a large portion of its value. You won't be able to resell it because a lot of upgrades are either too niche or you're buying it when it's at the top of demand. In other words, Mathil just released a video and everyone wants to play this. You're part of everyone, so you're paying more as a result. But items that are in relatively high demand and don't have many drop sources or creation sources, such as an item level 86 Fractured Global Defenses chest, well, that's a much more stable item. I got one from a flawless Chuyula. This was just a lucky drop, but it was worth 80x at the time. I then crafted it into a high ES armor base with usable suffixes. I spent around 30x crafting and finishing the item, so around 110x of value was locked up into it. A bit later, I swapped my current chest, a Fractured Global Defenses Vol Regalia, and I was able to sell my old chest for 120x. Not a lot of profit here, only about 10x, but because this is a high value item, and because it generally holds that value, I'm not too concerned about buying it even if I only plan to use it for a short time. Yes, it's a little bit annoying to have my money tied up for a few hours or a couple days, but I will get it back. And while I know I'm using an example here that costs an absurd amount of 120 exalts, there's a lot of items that don't cost nearly that much, which you can do the same thing with. Just think of something like the +1/+2 fizz damage over time or chaos damage over time bows used by things like Toxic Rain and Corrupting Fever. These bows have a relatively deterministic crafting process. This kind of puts a hard price floor down, where the bow isn't likely to go below it. And both of those builds, while not super meta, are definitely played commonly. As a result, they're very likely to maintain their value. If you bought one for 12 to 14x, you can be reasonably sure that it's going to sell for 12 to 14x later. After all, people aren't really going to keep making them if they're just cheaper to buy. And because people are still actively playing the build, even almost 2 months in, then there's going to be an active market. And so, what are some takeaways that I want to leave you with? The first is, don't be afraid to craft your gear. And when you're crafting, look for things that tend to have a low input cost versus their output cost. That way, as long as you're able to sell the failures, as long as you know there are other people out there who are playing your build or playing something similar, you should be able to craft your gear and make a profit while you're at it. The next thing is always, always, always live search. Don't go, all right, I'm swapping builds. Today, I need to buy all of my gear within the next 4 hours. You can do this, but you're going to pay sometimes double or even triple what you would have if you were a little more patient. Think about it this way. That pair of boots that I bought for 15 exalts on a live search, then sold for 45. Yes, I did input 2x to fix the prefixes. Yes, technically there's some failure chance there, but it was far more likely to be finished within 2 to 4x than it was to not be finished within that amount. So even if I spent 20 total, I still would have ended up with a very good deal. And finally, when there's an item that's in fairly high demand, but isn't that easy to make, or has a moderate fixed creation cost, then you can be relatively assured that it's going to hold its value. This will generally apply to rare items and synthesis bases. It won't apply so much to things like uniques. If you look at unique items, the problem is that they just get more and more common over time, and unless it's something like a Headhunter or a Mageblood, supply will outstrip demand. But again, just to be really, really, really clear, patience is your best friend here. Even if you're just doing something like Harvest, and you're rolling a bunch of implicits on your cluster jewels, patience is your friend. If you do 5 maps worth, and you get bored and you just go buy it, you might spend 4 or 5x. On the other hand, if you stick with a Harvest and you keep rolling the jewels, you might make 40 or 50x by the time you ultimately get your item. And the amount of money that you make on the things where you can save or can roll profitably can then be applied to the parts of a build that can't be, such as if you wanted to buy a Mageblood, or if you wanted something like a Fractured Grasping Mail, which, while it does hold its value very well, is going to cost you 80x upfront unless you get very lucky when fighting Flawless Chuyula. And personally, I don't really advise fighting Flawless Chuyula as a strategy to get it, because it's random, and I don't really know how random, but I suspect random enough that you could very well spend over 80x and not get one. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong about that. One thing I'm curious about though, what tricks do you use to upgrade your character and upgrade your gear in a profitable manner? Do you have any other tips that you think other people might find helpful? Or maybe you're new to this, and this has opened your eyes to how you might improve your character in the future. If so, what do you plan to do? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members: Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon, or if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord, link below. If you want more content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. It's a place that I use to review games, ramble my way through video essays, and a lot more. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.